sort of reviewing and going over the documentary Why Yung-Bong-Gil Threw a Bomb. And the hope here is to understand the sort of not just why he threw a bomb, but also the sort of history of the Korean independence movement and the significance of his act within the context of that, right? So let's get right into it. First, let's understand who this man was. Yung Bong-il was born on June 21st, 1908, in the South Chongcheong province, which in just a rural farming village that was around 120 kilometers southwest of Seoul. He was raised in a tenant farming household, and in his childhood, he helped plant rice and barley. His neighbors nicknamed him the village wildcat because of his fierce competitiveness. However, uh, while initially Yung Bong-il just enrolled in a normal Japanese elementary school, once he witnessed the nationwide protests happening against the Japanese occupation, he quit school, declaring that he refused to learn the language of slaves. After this, he shifted to a traditional Sedang to study Chinese classics as well as Korean history. Now, that's the understanding of his early childhood, right? Let's sort of understand Yung Bong-il, the activist and the leader of the Enlightenment movement. Now, initially, Yung Bong-il was did not use violence in his acts of resistance, right? His resistance were more centered around building this sort of enlightenment movement in Korea, and this sort of started initially with this headboards incident. What happened here was that a farmer in the village dug up all the headstones in the cemetery of the village, and he brought them to Yung Bong-il, and he said to Yung Bong-il, "Hey, which one of these is my father's?" And so, because the farmer was illiterate, he dug up all of them and brought them there just because he couldn't figure out which one his father's was. And this incident sort of jarred and shook Young Bong-il, and he realized that there was no way for Korea to become affluent without abolishing illiteracy. And so his initial resistance was very much centered around the idea of education, right? Here's a historian. He's explaining that Yung Bong-il's initial philosophy, right? He wanted to educate the people. And in that respect, right, he's established a night school for peasants in his village to wipe out illiteracy. He also wrote a booklet, a 30-page long booklet called The Farmer's Reader, Nongming Dokpon, on modern farming methods in his village, right? And so his initial acts of resistance are very much based around just education and literacy, right? Now, that's not the only thing he did. He also formed the organization known as the Buhumwong, and the goal of this organization was essentially just to increase production, to increase productivity, to increase economic activity for villages and farmers, not just in his village, but across the region that he was in, right? And these are the four objectives of the Buhungwang. But he also formed the Wojin Ho, which was sort of a subsidiary of the Buhungwang. And the a former chairman of the Wojin Ho, he explains that the Buhungwang was where they studied philosophies for how they can improve the plight of the Korean people, and the Wojin Ho was where they actually carried out those philosophies. So his initial years were very much involved with both these organizations, as well as, of course, his night school. Uh, and they were very much centered around increasing the productivity of Korean peasants, increasing their education level, making them a skilled and literate population. As part of that, right, one of his more famous sort of systems was this parcel out system. And the way this worked was that you bought pigs with membership fees, and you distributed them to members once they had piglets. So you distribute the litter proportionately to members with this parcel out system, and this sort of helped increase productivity for all the farmers and all the members of the system in his village. Now, this is this is a lot of his work with the initial Enlightenment movement, and this is just one example of the many different sort of philosophies that he followed in order to increase productivity and economic value in his village. But due to the actions that he took with both these organizations, he met a significant degree of resistance from Japanese colonizers. And I'll get into that later. But the sort of result of that was that he started to shift more towards sort of violent acts of resistance and sort of more actively resisting the Japanese, right? He founded a Confucian group in Hongseong, and independent fighters came from all over Korea, including Manchu, and this was sort of, as this Wo Jin-ho chairman put it, practice for what he would later do in Shanghai, which is throw a bomb. And so this is where we see his ideology beginning to sort of shift towards maybe more armed resistance, more violent resistance is necessary against the Japanese, a more active form of resistance. This sort of reached its apex when the Dongyong Colonization Company was established in Japan. And what this company did was that the rice and the barley, etc., that the farmers would grow, this would be there would be rice quotas, there would be barley quotas for the Japanese, and so the production of the farmers, rather than sort of providing much value to the farmers, would be essentially seized or taken at very extortionate prices by the Japanese through this colonization company and sort of shipped off to Japan via train lines and shipments for their benefit, right? So essentially, he saw the farmers being exploited by this company. And to further sort of build on that, his sort of enlightenment movement and resistance ran into more trouble with the Japanese police, right? Whenever both of his organizations, the Bojinho and the Bojinho, etc., sort of tried to do anything, even in the sense like they tried to do something non-violent, right? They would meet immense resistance from Japanese colonial police, and the establishment of the Dongyang Colonization Company only served to increase the presence and sort of the extent to which the Japanese colonial police were oppressing people in the region. And so at this point, he felt that he had run into a wall with the Enlightenment movement. That's to say that he felt that the Enlightenment movement could not help sufficiently liberate the Korean people anymore while the situation with the Japanese was like this, right? And so he wrote these two letters to his, he wrote more, but these are two letters that he wrote to his family as a farewell, right? As he left for Manchuria. And his message essentially was that he needs to leave in order to achieve his ideals, in order to follow his ideology. He wants to run freely in the vast plains of Manchuria, which is what he did. He worked odd jobs in Manchuria for 2 years in order to earn passage to Shanghai so he could join the Korean Provisional Government. Now, what is the Korean Provisional Government? It's essentially this resistance organization that at the time was being led by Kim Gu. And prior to the Patriotic Act, it wasn't taken as seriously as you'd think because it was in exile in China. And so a lot of people said considered it to be a provisional government in name only, according to the documentary. Now, what Yung-Bong-Gil wanted to do was he wanted to re-establish the legitimacy of that government, or at the very least, he wanted to work with that government in order to do something for Korean liberation, anything to speed it up, and so that's why he left for Manchuria. Now, what that ultimately ended up being once he came to Shanghai and he sort of collaborated with Kim Gu was that on April 29th, the day of the Emperor of Japan's birthday, there was a Victory Day celebration that Japan had sort of decided to designate in order to sort of raise public opinion, raise like sort of the status of the emperor in Shanghai. And so what happened is they set up this lunchbox bomb and water canteen bomb because those were the only two things you were allowed to bring to the event, which Yung-Bong-Gil would throw in order to sort of bomb the event, right? Basically at Hongkou Park. And now this is Hongkou Park today, where there's a monument that commemorates his patriotic deed. And so this is sort of how we built up to what Yung-Bong-Gil ultimately did. What he did that day in Shanghai did in fact kill, I believe it killed a general of the Japanese military and it injured a few other people. But more importantly, what it sort of did was it brought a lot of attention to the Korean Provisional Government at the time. As this historian succinctly puts it, after he succeeded, the government became known to the world. There was no way that you could ignore the Korean Provisional Government after this. Perhaps most notably, though, the what this government essentially did was it sort of set up the support of Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the Kuomintang in China, which was sort of at the time it was the most powerful force in China. China wasn't united at the time, but it was probably the most powerful force in China at the time. Uh, and so he acknowledged the provisional government and he gave them full sort of support and he sort of started to bankroll them. He recognized them basically as a legitimate political force, which is what this Patriotic Act did. And so it can be argued, and is very successfully argued by many Korean historians, that this was a very significant part of the Korean independence movement, and it helped set up the resistance the entire resistance that Kim Gu had to the Japanese colonizers, that ultimately led to them leaving, and ultimately led to a free Korea at the time. And so this is a monument dedicated to him and his patriotic act. And so ultimately, the lessons that we sort of learned from this whole act and from this documentary, well, is of course the history of Korean independence and of the sort of provisional government, the extent of Japan's suppression in Korea, and the different methods that people had of working against it, specifically the Enlightenment movement that was taking place alongside a lot of the armed resistance that was taking place and a lot of the guerrilla warfare that was taking place. And lastly, of course, we understand the nuance of the use of violence in resistance movements and how oftentimes they just become seen as necessary and as the only option. And so I hope this sort of brief movie review was helpful for you in understanding why Yung Bong Hill threw a bomb and the greater context of the Korean independence movement at the time. Thank you very much for watching.